I first heard of climate change and the risk of climate change in about 1995. The corporation has been studying climate change for a very long time, long before it was even part of the public vernacular. We have a corporate strategic research organization, which we have 4 research organizations, but corporate strategic research deals only with fundamental scientific questions. So they're not trying to invent things, they're not trying to develop things that the chemical company or the explorers can use. They're looking at very basic scientific questions, and so they have been investigating this a very long time. When the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established, first established now almost 20 years ago, our scientists were the only scientists from the oil industry to be part of the IPCC, and we still are today. So we have been members of the IPCC, we have authored many of their papers, we have peer-reviewed all their papers. So we have been engaged in the understanding and the evolution of our understanding of climate change for decades. And we approach everything from a fundamental science question, okay? And so what I would tell you is words like climate consensus don't mean anything to us. They ring hollow because that's an oxymoronic statement. You cannot have a scientific consensus. You can have a consensus around a scientific theory, but science, once proved, is science. It's like gravity. You don't need a consensus to say gravity exists. It's gravity. And climate is one of the most complicated, if not the most complicated, studies of science today going on. And it's going on broadly all over the world. When we were first studying it, not very many people were interested. We were working with a few academics, a few government scientists, but it now has evolved, and it's evolved in many ways because the technology available to us is so advanced to what we had a few years ago. A few years ago, we were looking at a handful of data points. Now we have the entire globe instrumented, from ocean buoys to satellites to air monitors we're getting data points by the millions now. And this is great because it's a science problem. The real challenge is building these models to try to predict the future. And in the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, and most people have never read them, most policymakers have never read them, but if you read their reports, they have a science report on climate modeling. And my favorite chart is in there, and it's a chart of projection of future temperature against CO2 concentrations, and there's like 20-something models. None of them agree. Some of them say we're going to get cooler. Some of them say we're going to get really warm. And there is no model that has yet been developed that scientists would say is competent at predicting the future. Now, so that is the state of play of the science. What we have come to the conclusion over that long period of study, and I've spent time with the MIT scientists that work on the climate models that we've supported development of. I've spent time with the Stanford scientists. We have come to the conclusion that this is a serious risk. We don't know, and anyone who tells you they know beyond a shadow of a doubt is simply not giving you a scientific answer. They're giving you an opinion. So our view of it is climate change is a serious risk, and it's a risk that we need to manage. And we're in the risk management business. That's what we do. So how should we manage this risk? And how do you manage it from a scientific standpoint? And how do you manage it from the way you use energy? And how do you manage it from your energy sources? And how do you manage it with public policy? Those are all elements of how you want to manage the risk. And we are engaged and participate in every one of those areas. And where we get the most attention directed at us is on the policy side, because we engage in policies that recognize this is a serious risk. It does have uncertainty about its outcome, and people hate that word uncertainty. But that's just a fact. We really don't know for certain how this is going to turn out. Now, you're going to make policies that are going to have dramatic impacts on the economy, not just our economy, but the economy of the developing world. And what you got to remember is there's 1.7 billion people out there that still don't have electricity. They don't have running water. They can't refrigerate medicines. They can't refrigerate food. they would like to have
At this point,
access
you're
to
channeling
energy.
my grandfather. Like,
Yeah, they'd like to have access to energy. And so they have an aspiration to lift themselves out of poverty. It's going to take energy to do that. So the grand challenge for us, for ExxonMobil and for the people in my industry is, how are we going to meet the world's energy needs in the future and do it in a way that is environmentally responsible and manages this risk of climate change? And it involves a lot of trade-offs. And the thing that I get most disheartened about in our public debate is that most of the public discourse is at both extremes. It's at both extremes, you know, and that's not where the solution is going to be found. The solution is going to be found by thoughtful people coming into the middle and saying, yeah, it's a risk. I don't know how this is going to turn out. I got to do things that make sense for the long term, for the economy, and we got a lot of competing priorities, and we're just going to have to manage those. It's not a discussion that we can find very many people willing to have, and that is very disheartening to me.